Bill C-69, which made changes to the Environmental Impact Assessment Act, it was very contentious over the last couple of years, with industry saying it was a pipeline killer and so on. And MP Greg McLean from Calgary Centre has put out a press release today outlining some concerns with regulatory uncertainty and the effect that that's had on investment in the resource sector. And his background is in oil and gas finance, so we're very curious to see what he has to say. Welcome to the interview, Greg.
Thank you, Markham. Thanks for having me.
Why don't we start with a brief overview of the argument that you laid out in your press release, please?
Well, we look at what's holding up resource development in Canada, and true to what we were saying when the Impact Assessment Act was passed under Bill C-69 in the last Parliament. So now we actually don't have a C-69 anymore. C-69 has been passed. We have a framework now, including the Impact Assessment Act, that actually has a ministerial role to, in many ways, delay, in many ways, get a project list about where the minister can himself, in this case, Minister Wilkinson himself, intervene wherever he feels he needs to interject in a project that he thinks might impact something he doesn't like in Canada. So the guidelines are rather clear on paper, and yet there is an override to those guidelines that the minister can enforce at any time.
Right. I understand that that was a concern. So let's talk about one example, which is the recently the Canadian Energy Regulator approved some changes to the natural gas trunk line, the natural NGTL as it's known. And there had been some complaints that the regulator and the government were dragging their feet on this. And the minister responded with a press release, I think it was a couple of days ago, saying that the reason for the delay was Section 35 of the Constitution, which requires the government to consult with Aboriginal peoples. They wanted to do it right. That's what took so long. So while the critics said regulatory uncertainty because of the new act, the minister says, no, it was Section 35. What's your response to that?
When I asked the minister about that as well, directly, I asked the department about that directly, and I asked the proponent about that directly as well. So we had all kinds of information there that didn't seem to jive as far as what was actually happening. Now you got a pipeline here, NGTL, that's been in service in Alberta for 50, 60 years. 1950, I believe, is when it was initially built. And it's brought natural gas down from the northwest part of Alberta, the northeast part of BC, down the line along the Rocky Mountains from Grand Prairie all the way down to the pricing points in Calgary. We're expanding that. Nova Gas, what was the previous Nova Gas, that's why it's called NGTL, Nova Gas Trunk Line. It's now part of the TC Energy system. They're expanding that because there's a lot more gas coming out of that region of our provinces and coming down to the price points, obviously to get to market in the United States. It's about a $2.3 billion leg of a $9 billion project to make that system work better and therefore get better pricing for our producers up in that region. And there's all kinds of points of volatility in there. So it makes all the sense in the world. We're getting better access to North American markets, but you still got to go through a process. Even though the pipe is already in the ground, you're not creating any new infrastructure, you're just expanding the infrastructure that's there. Nevertheless, you're going to have an impact because you're going to do a little construction. And they've gone through that process. And that process was approved by the Canadian Energy Regulator in February this year. So 8 months ago. And then the federal cabinet has 90 days at that point in time to actually say yes, no on it. And they took the full 90 days to say no, and suddenly they produced a letter. It's the same letter that had Indigenous concerns about the spread of COVID during this pandemic at any construction sites along the pipeline expansion. So they halted it there, and they took a full 6-month delay on it at that point in time, holding that letter up saying, we need to do further Indigenous consultation because there might be some exposure to COVID. That was the initial response. When I talked to the minister said that we have to do our full work here with the Indigenous associations. Now, what I'm trying to find out is the Indigenous associations along the current construction route recognize in this winter approval for this $2.3 billion actual expansion that we're not talking about the full length of it. We're talking about a certain percentage of it. And if there was any real reason for those bands to oppose it. I didn't get that direct response from anybody. So that's something we're finding ourselves a little constrained about in the current environment. Nevertheless, That's what should be there at that point in time. Make sure all the bands along the way, number one, are well represented as far as what their work, the work along the pipeline goes. So the indigenous benefit agreements that are part of the process. That'll have to, that has to be part of it.
Let's talk about another project, and Teck Resources, which withdrew its application here back in the spring, and there was a big, as you know, big controversy over that. Premier Jason Kenney was saying that it was federal regulatory uncertainty that caused the problem. Teck in its letter said climate policy was a big deal. Last weekend, the premier at the UCP annual general meeting said lack of climate policy, problems with climate policy is holding up. Because of that, federal projects can't get financed. And so there, again, we have a conflict here where on the one side it's federal regulatory uncertainty, but then it's climate policy and it's something else that's actually the culprit. So how do you respond to that?
Yeah, well, I'll be quite clear on that one. I'll call nonsense to all the parties at the table because frankly, Teck Frontier was going to be approved. And you take a look at the process they went through, the years and the hundreds of millions of dollars to get that project over the line. That was something where they met every proposal: climate, environment, indigenous affairs. It is the benchmark for how to get through an assessment here. And when it was initially coming up for final approval in Ottawa, I thought it was a slam dunk. And it looked like it was a slam dunk. And then you watch the political machinery work around it, and you realize a week and a half into that 2-week process, when we were expecting the actual announcement to finally come, you realize when the Liberals came out of their caucus meeting that certain elements within their caucus had actually rallied around making sure that they were not going to approve it, because they spoke very boldly about it not being approved. So in as much as something happened, in my opinion, behind the scenes that Teck Frontier withdrew at that point in time, that makes no sense for anybody that actually is watching the game here, because they went through years of this process. To actually walk away from it less than 2 weeks from the final decision is a little bit of misbelief, if you ask me.
Well, that's fair enough. Let's get back then to the Impact Assessment Act and your comment about the minister having too much political influence on the final decision, which I guess the pressure can come up from caucus to the minister. And that actually was brought into the Act and originally in 2012 under the Harper government, SIA 2012. And do you think then that the Act should be amended so that kind of ministerial discretion is either limited or eliminated altogether?
Yeah, and let me correct that. As far as I remember working with cabinets years ago on similar types of situations, and there was always governor and council, GIC, that is cabinet approval required for regulatory approvals. And that changed a little bit under the, I think under the Greg Martin government, and went back to being GIC approval again under the Harper government. And there was a lot of projects that required that final input. In the end, Canada is a democracy where the government does approve these things. And GIC, Government and Council, is the acting part of government. So I didn't find what was happening under Harper to be that egregious. What happens in the Impact Assessment Act is that there is too much power put in one minister's hands repeatedly here, and he can exercise that power at any time, including especially delays, offsets, without real explanation for why they're doing that. And if he's working behind the scenes with the company to make sure that, like with Teck, as I say, if you believe that Teck withdrew at the very last minute after all the time and money they put into it, well, there's land in Florida. I think somebody can sell you here. But that's where the actual problem is. Let me give another example that's happening here in Alberta right now with the Vista mine. And the Vista mine, you take a look, it's totally within Alberta. So you would think it's, according to the Impact Assessment Act guidelines, it would not be subject to the Impact Assessment Act because it's going to be increasing in size by less than 50%. And they designed it that way. They met the guidelines for not being reviewed under the Impact Assessment Act. And Minister Wilkinson stepped in to review it anyways. So, you have companies here that are following a process, obeying a process about which regulator they're going to go through in order to complete an expansion of their mine. Whether you agree with the mine or not isn't at hand here. What they're actually doing is looking at the law and saying, here's how we follow the law in Canada. and go through this process. And yet arbitrarily, the Minister of the Environment steps in and asserts his own jurisdiction where it really was Alberta's jurisdiction.
Greg, is it fair to say then that you have two big problems with the Environmental Assessment Act? One is the Act allows the minister to have too much discretion. And secondly, the Liberals seem to be exercising that discretion arbitrarily and too often.
To be certain, yes. You know, you take a look at, Cabinet's always going to have to be responsible for the decisions it makes. Cabinet is a decision-making body that in a democracy, we actually allow to do that. And that's what we elect people to do. Now, if this government wants to be transparent and say to the project proponents, we are not going to allow XYZ projects, then say so up front. Say so up front so people can vote on that and make a democratic election process in that choice. That is what we're here for. But to actually obfuscate and make these proponents go through a process that looks like it's clear on paper, only to pull the rug out from it at the end of the day, is not a forward-thinking way for a democratic country to act.
Greg, thank you very much for this. It was some interesting insights on your part. Really appreciate that. And thank you again for being here. We'll look forward to our next chat.
Thank you, Markham. It's a pleasure.